So in our last video, we discussed how absinthe is prepared and consumed in what we call the Absinthe Ritual. Well, today we're going to cover a number of other topics, such as the history of it and myths about it. So we'll start from the top chronologically. The history of absinthe. The first recorded instance that we see of at least an advertisement for absinthe was in a Swiss newspaper in 1769. About 3 years later, the ingredient, the concoction was sold to a fellow by the name of Dr. Ordinaire, and yes, that is his real name, Dr. Ordinaire, who modified it and turned it into a concoction of 8 different ingredients. Wormwood being the foundational ingredient for what we know as absinthe. Why absinthe is called absinthe is because one of the root words for wormwood is absinthium, hence absinthe. In the mid to early 18th century is when it comes to be, but then where you really get it popularized was by French soldiers returning from the Algiers War in the mid-1800s. The French government actually provided rations of absinthe to their troops, thinking they would help them be awake and alert more often and more effectively. So when the French troops came back to France, which is of course where this drink is most popular, or was, and is again, that's when it really took off, was mid-1800s, thanks to the French troops returning from the front lines who had grown accustomed and fond of this drink. In fact, almost overnight, production went up 20-fold thanks to that phenomenon. Now, with regards to one of the myths of wormwood, there's a myth that more is better, and that's not necessarily true. The formulas that we have today, that you did, for instance, this one, the amount of wormwood present is about the same as it was in the pre-ban era. So a little goes a long way. Another myth we want to dispel is the whole wormwood or absinthium as a hallucinogen. It is absolutely not a hallucinogen. You don't hallucinate. You don't see green fairies when you drink absinthe. Where you get the term the green fairy is that in French they would refer to this drink as l'effet verte, which translates to the green fairy, and that has to do with, again, the root words of the botanicals that are used in the drink. So that's where that comes from. Basically going off of the root words of the ingredients used, not the actual effects of consuming the drink. So very important to remember. One of the other myths I want to dispel, and Travis, you're obviously going to have to chop this up because I'm rambling and I'm trying to hit all my points here, but one of the other myths we want to dispel is that wormwood was what not only caused the hallucinogenic type stuff, which again it didn't, but that also was the cause for deaths and blindness and maiming and that sort of thing, basically adverse health effects, when in fact what you had going on was again 2 parts, and you had bad actors in the market, and they were fairly rare, but you also had bad actors on the government side, just like during the American Prohibition, where it's well documented that government entities actually poisoned alcohol and then sent it out into the populace. Same thing occurred in Europe and in parts of America with regards to absinthe. In order to get people to stop drinking it, to fearmonger it into being banned, bad batches of absinthe were released, poisoned by the government and released into the population, and then when people got sick and hurt, then the wine industry and the government could point to that and say, oh hey, look, it's killing people, we need to ban it. So classic government fare there. That was one leg of it. The other leg was some bad actors, again rare, but there were a few bad actors in the private sector who used copper sulfate to color the absinthe green. Now, I don't know about you, I'm no chemist, but I know that if you put copper sulfate in something I'm drinking, that's probably not going to turn out so well for me or for you. And that's where you have some of the instances of adverse health effects with absinthe. That was not a widespread issue, not nearly as widespread as most people like to think, but it did occur from time to time, especially as the popularity increased and demand increased and more players got in the game to turn a cheap buck. You know, things like that do happen from time to time. But that's your 1-2 punch of where the myth of, oh, absinthe will hurt you or maim you or kill you comes from. Around the turn of the 20th century is when absinthe hit its zenith, but also fell off the precipice. At the time, you had famous artists and composers and writers like Van Gogh or Picasso or Oscar Wilde, who were well known to imbibe often in absinthe, along with the entire class of artists and writers across the Western civilized world, Europe and Americas primarily. France and Germany and Switzerland is where you saw it most in Europe, and then of course the major cities in the US. What you saw though around 1910 is that as absinthe actually became the most popular drink in the Western world, which sounds crazy, but it's true, the wine industry, combined with a few bad actors in the market, is what precipitated the fall of absinthe overall. So, what happened to absinthe? Why was it banned? Well, two main reasons. Government, listening to the wine lobby. When absinthe eclipsed wine as the most popular drink in France, that's when the wine industry had enough, and they concocted a bunch of false studies, a bunch of fake studies, and they paired up and they lobbied the French government to essentially make up stories about the dangers of absinthe, the cultural dangers of absinthe, the physical harms of absinthe, and pushed for a ban, which they did get in 1915 actually. Ironically enough, Switzerland was the first European country to ban it, which was its country of origin. So in 1910, Switzerland banned it, in 1915, France banned it, and in 1923, Germany banned it. The US was right in the middle of that mix. It was banned in 1912 with the US, along with everything else for Prohibition. And in the US, absinthe actually did not make a reappearance until 2007, with limitations. You couldn't actually have much wormwood, which without the wormwood, absinthe isn't really absinthe. It was only up in 2014 when we could get real absinthe again with the wormwood. So that's why most Americans haven't seen it. That's why most Americans haven't had a chance to enjoy it. Absinthe is very botanical. There are many different brands, but the overtone flavor in most absinthes does tend to be anise, or black licorice, if you will. That's what most people tend to get. But that's why the Absinthe Ritual is so important. Because if you were just to take a serving of just absinthe on its own, it is a very strong drink, very potent. Again, not in a hallucinogenic way, just as far as ABV is concerned. In fact, traditional absinthe is 136 proof, which is 68% alcohol by volume. It's quite a bit, even for the most tried and true and tested drinkers such as myself. So with the absinthe fountain, and we've discussed this before, but that's where you drop the water into it and a little bit of sugar and that sort of thing, so you can take it as you please, stronger or lighter. Because as we say, absinthe is to be enjoyed. It's not a chore. It's supposed to be a delight. So today, the best absinthe comes from Switzerland, France, and America. It's the cleanest. It's the main difference between those three countries of origin and anywhere else is that it's distilled. With those three countries, the absinthe is distilled, so it's going to be nice, crisp, clean, the way you're supposed to drink it, no harmful effects. In other countries, they use oils and the botanicals, and the consistency can be not as nice, and the quality control is a little tougher. So typically, if you're shopping for absinthe, you want to stick with those three countries of origin: Switzerland, France, or the US. And so there's a little more information about absinthe so you guys can enjoy it in your own way. Cheers.